My name's Joe Banks and I produce an electronic music and installation art project called Disinformationist. I have an exhibit here at the Freud Museum in London called The Portrait of Jean Genet. It's part of an event called the Festival of the Unconscious, which has been set up by the Freud Museum to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Freud's groundbreaking paper on the unconscious. As part of this project, we have this installation, The Portrait of Jean Genet. It's based on an interview that the French author, burglar, prostitute, poet and playwright Jean Genet gave to the BBC in 1985, shortly before he died in 1986. During the interview, he sort of very interestingly responds to a question from the interviewer by saying, did you say love? Did you refer to love? Vous avez dit la mort? Because j'ai entendu la mort, I heard death. You know, the phrase, or the sounds, love and death, l'amour and l'amour are virtually identical.
Vous avez dit l'amour, j'ai entendu la mort. Vous avez dit l'amour, j'ai entendu la mort. Vous avez dit l'amour, j'ai entendu la mort. Vous avez dit l'amour, j'ai entendu la mort.
You know, in context of the Freud Museum, you know, I think most members of the public are probably familiar with the concept of a Freudian slip, but what's less well known is the extent to which very similar unconscious processes are sort of articulated and revealed through hearing as well as through the actual production of speech. So, you know, the way people hear sounds also reveals something about their unconscious predispositions in much the same way that Freudian slips can also reveal something about people's unconscious predispositions. The Portrait of Jean Genet installation sort of focuses centrally on a sort of visual metaphor with the so-called Necker cube illusion. It was discovered by the Swiss crystallographer Louis Albert Necker. You know, what you have with the Necker cube is obviously a cube drawn in three-dimensional space, but it's drawn without perspective. So, you know, the mind has to make a decision about whether the cube's looking towards you or looking away from you, and your interpretation of that information can flip inside your own mind spontaneously as you're looking at it. And what you have with the Portrait of Jean Genet video and sound installation is, you know, this analogy between the perceptual inversions produced by looking at the Necker cube illusion and the mishearing that Jean Genet manifested during this interview with the BBC. And it, from my point of view, it forms part of a sort of broader research project. I published a book called Rorschach Audio. Hermann Rorschach was a Freudian psychoanalyst who died in 1921. He very famously developed the system whereby, you know, people splash ink on a piece of paper, fold it in two, open it up again, reveal these kind of fantastical, ambiguous, symmetrical figures. The interpretation of this subjective imagery is perceived by some psychoanalysts to be a sort of indicator of certain personality traits. The Rorschach Audio book and research project explores the ramifications of the analogy between the way people perceive visual images in the Rorschach inkblot test and the way people perceive meanings in potentially or actually ambiguous sounds.
J'ai entendu la mort. Vous avez dit l'amour. J'ai entendu la mort. Vous avez dit l'amour. J'ai entendu la mort.
Possibly, you know, the l'amour mishearing was something that he used as one of his kind of conversational ploys in situations like this, but, you know, undoubtedly it did have really profound resonance with a lot of the imagery in his work and also with his own life experiences. You know, he describes in a section that Jean-Paul Sartre quotes from Genet in Jean-Paul Sartre's book Saint Genet. Genet is quoted as having said that, you know, the association between love and death was kind of inculcated in him when he wrote his first poem at the age of 20 on the 10th anniversary of the death of a girl that he'd been infatuated with when he was 10. There's a little quotation from Sartre's book Saint-Genet, which is Genet himself speaking. He says, "When I wrote poems, the words rose and death flowed together from my pen too often for me to persist in attributing these encounters to chance. There must have been certain forces in my unconscious, complexes, childhood memories, desires, etc., which produced this association so regularly. There must have been, otherwise the fact would not be intelligible. You will object that I know nothing precise about death, but since I've spoken about it so often in a tone of gravity, it is because death must live within me. The proof is that it springs from my slightest word." During the BBC interview, Genet was sort of famously quite grumpy with the interviewer. I think something happened the day before that had pissed him off because he made some reference to what you said yesterday. So I think they'd had a kind of chat beforehand that had gone badly.
Vous êtes là, je suis ici. En ce moment, je me sens à part aussi. J'ai toujours été à part, que ce soit dans mon enfant, que ce soit chez vous.
Mais est-ce qu'il y avait des moments alors quand vous n'étiez pas à part?
Non.
Jamais dans la vie?
Non.
Même pas avec, je sais pas, quand vous étiez avec quelqu'un, un amour comme ça, vous croyez que l'homme est toujours seul?
L'homme, je ne sais pas. Je ne vais pas généraliser. Mais moi, oui.
Et ça vous angoissait?
Pas du tout. Ce qui m'angoisserait, ce serait qu'il n'y ait pas de distance entre vous et moi.
Jean Genet was born in 1910 as the son of a prostitute, and his mother gave him up for adoption at the age of about 7 months, I think. He was taken care of by a couple of different adoptive families, had a troubled childhood and adolescence, ended up in a reform school for a while, then joined the French Foreign Legion, was dishonourably discharged from the French Foreign Legion for committing lewd acts, and kind of drifted across Europe for some years, supporting himself through burglary and male prostitution, you know, various forms of petty crime, you know, before he submitted his first poems for publication, and, you know, subsequently published his first book in 1946.
Est-ce que pour vous, oui, l'amour a commencé pas avec la famille, mais avec un garçon, je crois?
Non, pas avec un garçon, avec 200. Qu'est-ce que vous racontez? Comme si...
Avec 200? Ah ouais.
L'un après l'autre.
Genet was probably one of the most outspoken and sort of direct and explicit portrayers of you know, gay life in French literature. So, you know, after the publication of his first few novels in 1950, Jean Genet expressed his desire to make a film to a friend of his called Nico Papadakis, who'd he'd previously been involved, you know, essentially a kind of burglary team, burgling rich households in Paris with his friend Nico Papadakis, who went on to become a nightclub owner, running a club that was popular with a sort of bohemian intelligentsia in Paris in the late 40s. And they produced a film together called Un Chant de Mort. The films are very, very stylised, you know, beautifully produced, very sexually explicit, homoerotic fantasy. You know, not only is the sexual content, you know, pretty jaw-dropping even by today's standards, but I mean, it was specifically a sort of men in prison film. There's an absolutely incredible scene where these two prisoners are in separate cells, are sharing a cigarette by blowing smoke through a tiny hole in somebody's drilled in the prison walls through a kind of like 2mm thick, 10-inch long straw. but I believe it was really intended to be more of a porn film than an art film in its original form. And in context of which, you know, there's a famous story that Princess Margaret attended a special screening of Jean d'Amour in the company of Lord Snowden and a few other notable people.
Vous n'habitez pas la France maintenant. Vous habitez...
Non, le Maroc.
Mais vous avez une maison à Maroc?
Non.
Vous baladez avec des amis, si je peux utiliser ça?
Non, j'habite l'hôtel.
Et pourquoi le Maroc?
Je peux vous poser une question. Et pourquoi pas le Maroc? Et pourquoi cette question? Parce que vous voulez me transformer encore, vous aussi, en mythe.
You know, the issue of Genet's self-mythologization is quite an interesting one because, you know, the stories of the extraordinary lifestyle that brought him to the attention of, you know, his supporters in the early days of his literary career were, you know, undoubtedly real. You know, he might have exaggerated bits from here and there, but, you know, the title of Jean-Paul Sartre's book, Saint-Genet, is, you know, it's like intrinsically putting him on a pedestal as a sort of object of worship, you know, and ironic as that may have been, you know, his reputation sort of led to him experiencing a fair degree of sort of hero worship, I think, from, you know, people who were interested in his literature, yeah. As he grew older, I think, although I can't really say for sure, but I think he really kind of lost interest in writing. He started producing essays, often political essays, getting involved in activist politics, and I think he more or less, the impression I get is that he more or less kind of lived off the royalties from his novels and became more distant from his kind of literary reputation as he became more interested in sort of campaigning on social issues. You know, he went to America to stay with Black Panthers for 3 months, campaigned on sort of Palestinian issues, a number of other things like that. So I think he got bored of sort of people, or frustrated with people sort of building him up to be a kind of heroic figure, and he was trying to emphasize that he was essentially a pretty ordinary guy in some respects, you know.
Vous voulez qu'on aborde le problème du temps? Je répondrai comme Saint Augustin à propos du temps. J'attends la mort.